I'm delighted to introduce Professor Jacqui Matthews. Jacqui has a PhD in parasitology from the University of Glasgow. She then spent over 25 years in academia. She got her fellowship in the Royal College in 2017 for her contribution to knowledge, mostly on what she's going to talk about today. A lot of you will know Jacqui for her development of the red worm test, which she's taken to Austin Davis Biologics, where she is company director of vet science there now. We decided last night that we were going to get Jacqui a t-shirt, the Worm Girl, we've decided. She really has revolutionised our approach to both testing and treating these horses, so we're delighted to have her with us today. Thank you, Jacqui.
Thank you so much, Camilla. It's absolutely delighted to be here. I've been here several times over many years. I just don't know where the time has gone. And it's so great to see so many familiar faces. Whether you're sleeping or not, it's just great to see you here. Okay, so I was set this question by Camilla for a talk today, so I'm going to take you through that. I have been accused of being a bit of a doom and gloom lady. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the bad news first, and then hopefully we'll be able to go through some of the solutions at the end of this talk and in the next one. Okay, so the main concepts we have to take home in terms of worm control, and that's whether it's a foal, a yearling, an adult horse or an aged horse, is that most horses are exposed to worms while they're on pasture, and younger horses are more prone to these higher burdens, and that's where it's really important in your industry to understand that susceptibility and the impact it can have. The bad news for the horse sector is that we now have wormer resistance in all the important parasites of horses, so it's quite bleak at the moment. And as far as we're aware from the sector, there's no new active ingredients coming to market for use in horses for controlling worms. Sadly, horses are seen as a minor species, and there's not going to be sufficient profits, I would think, to be made by Big Pharma in developing a new wormer from scratch. And that is really the sort of background to that is the big companies spent millions of pounds in the sort of 90s trying to find new actives for use against parasitic nematodes and really didn't come up with much, actually, despite huge screening activity. So it wasn't through lack of trying. What we've got to do, very first principle in worm control, is to undertake a risk assessment. You've got to, it's like any other infectious disease of animals, you've got to stand back, ideally, particularly at stud farm level, to speak to your vet and say, what have we got, what are we doing, and what have we done historically? And I'll take you through the steps of that this morning. The cornerstone of good parasite control is always going to be excellent pasture management. And we know enough about the life cycle of these parasites and the impact of pasture management strategies to really have a positive effect. We can then support that with diagnostic testing to identify which horses have more worms and which horses have less, and then we have to treat less and target those treatments to the horses that require worming. And in that way, we reduce selection pressure for resistance. In the context of today, most breeding premises are at high infection risk. That's just really a given because of the presence and the high proportion of younger animals that are there, together with that history of repeated interval treatments over many years. So they're also at high risk of having drug-resistant parasites on that particular premise. In terms of our age of individual animals and the parasitic risks that we have, I'm just going to, oh, there we go. I'll try not to blast anyone with a laser. Obviously, very young foals can be infected with threadworm or strongyloides, but we don't see that as a pathogenic issue in terms, and horses shouldn't really be treated for threadworm unless it's been identified as a risk of disease by your veterinary surgeon. Certainly, ascarids are a big threat to foals, young horses, partly because they're big, nasty, spaghetti-like worms, and I hope you're all glad that I'm in before lunch. But also as well, anthelmintic resistance is a big issue in ascarid worms. Then, as foals graze, they start to pick up small redworm or cyathostomin infections, and we usually see higher burdens in individuals up to 5 years old. And again, Older geriatric horses, more probable in the leisure horse field, that perhaps have PPID, are also susceptible to higher burdens of these parasites. The tapeworm, the common one, Anoplacephala perfoliata, is a very common parasite, but it varies in prevalence between different groups of animals. And the evidence of age-related susceptibility is inconsistent, so I think we should just accept at the moment that all horses are susceptible to being infected with tapeworm if they're on a premises that have infected intermediate hosts with tapeworm. The wormer classes, which I'm sure you're all aware of, are basically 4 that we have for using in horses, 3 that are designed to target roundworms or nematodes. Class 1 BZs came out in the 60s, Parentel about 10 years later, and then the revolutionary drugs, the macrocyclic lactones, were developed in the 80s and 90s, ivermectin and moxidectin. And I'm sure no thoroughbred in the United Kingdom or the United States and many other countries through the 80s and 90s and since has never been exposed to these two particular products. Tapeworms, we can use a Parentel product at twice the dose used for roundworms to treat tapeworms, and a different wormer called Praziquantel, which is very specific for tapeworm type parasites. Now, you can't all really be blamed for developing resistance, because when I was at vet school in the 80s, we were all taught that if we just keep treat horses every 6 weeks or whatever, we'll eradicate the worms. These wormers were so good that we would just eradicate those worms. And what we found is that worm populations are very big within groups of animals, particularly young animals, and genetically, at a DNA level, they're very polymorphic. So even when you start to treat a group of horses with a new product, there might be worms within that horse's population that have polymorphisms or changes in their DNA that allows them to be less sensitive to that drug. And it's just typical Darwinian theory. If you select for those worms that are able to survive in the presence of a selective pressure, then you'll select for an increase in those parasites that are less susceptible to the drug. So that's what we used to do. We used to say, right, just target these stages in the host and we'll reduce the eggs in dung, and we've got it solved. And here we are 40 years later, and that's not the case. In terms of the parasitic threats that your horses will be exposed to, this is a particularly nasty worm of foals, Parascaris species. It lives in the small intestine, but has a migratory life cycle. So the foals pick up these very resistant eggs from the paddocks that contain the larvae, and then it's fascinating, the larvae hatch out of the eggs, and they go via the lungs, the liver and the lungs, to make their way back to the intestine. So the clinical signs that you can see in foals exposed to heavy burdens of ascarids are both associated with the migratory life cycle, particularly through the lungs, and the impact of these large, big, spaghetti-like, noodle-like worms in the small intestine. Wormer resistance is a big problem in this parasite, particularly to macrocyclic lactones, but we're also now getting reports of resistance to the other classes of anthelmintics. What we do see with Parascaris is this age-dependent immunity. It's quite unusual for a multicellular parasite to induce a strong immune response. We see it with lungworm in cattle, we see it with hookworm in dogs, and we see it with this parasite. And these tend to be migratory parasites, which means they probably stimulate a good immune response that's able to control the migratory stages of those parasites. So as the foals get older, they're able to control their burden better, their fecal egg counts drop, and they're less likely to be affected by the effects of the ascarid worm. We've actually seen formal reports of ivermectin resistance in this worm for over 20 years now, plus additional reports of resistance to moxidectin, which you find in Equest or Pramox, and probably more worryingly now reports of resistance to benzimidazoles and Parentel type products. So you have a situation where there's been poor management and lots of use of anthelmintics of different classes, that you might have multi-drug resistance there, and that's obviously going to be catastrophic for those animals that are more susceptible to higher worm burdens if you can't treat an animal with a high worm burden because the wormers don't work. The small red worms are parasites that are a little bit more boring, but I find them exciting. They tend to not migrate. They are larvae on pasture, and they just go into the large intestine of the horse, into the colon and cecum, and they undergo this period of development here They burrow their way into the intestinal wall and they produce these cysts. And they can build up, on contaminated pasture, horses can build up immense burdens of these parasites. When I worked at Liverpool Vet School, we used to get material from the local abattoir, and we would take parts of the intestine and calculate the worm burden. And we were counting an estimated worm burden of Cyathostomans of 6 to 9 million worms in individual horses. So they can build up. And if they do build up at those levels of burden, you can get this reactivation of these encysted stages back out of the large intestinal wall, where you get inflammation and damage, which you get a severe colitis, which we all know is larval cyathostominosis, which has a 50% case fatality rate. So you don't really want to be getting to this stage. Particularly horses, 1, 2, 3, 4-year-olds are particularly susceptible to this disease on dirty pasture. The good news is that most horses do develop a slower immunity, and most of them develop an immunity that controls those burdens to a lower level. So what you tend to see in animal populations, horse populations, is this uneven distribution. We call it a binomial distribution, where usually only 20% of the population have 80% of the burden. And that's what we use in testing to reduce our treatments. This little cartoon just explains what I said a minute ago, where when you go in with a first treatment and the worm population is so large and the DNA is so polymorphic, as that drug targets a particular protein, there will be worms within that population that have a change in their DNA that means that protein's less susceptible to the effects of the drug. And then those worms survive. And then what we do, and particularly what we were told to do at vet school way back in the 80s, you just dose and move to clean pasture. So what you would do is you would dose them, and then you'd move them onto clean pasture. And any surviving parasites, the less susceptible or more resistant parasites, would be the only population that were on that grass. It's a great way to select resistance, and that's what people do experimentally in sheep, to select resistance. You dose them and you move them to clean pasture so they don't compete. So what we want to do when we apply treatments is to think about, well, we either reduce that contamination of the worms that are on the pasture, or if we're unable to do that, is treat them in such a way that you're getting a dilutionary effect of worms that are not under selection pressure from treatment. Now, we can detect resistance in the field, and I'm sure those of you that work in stud farms have had experience of this now. I've been rattling on about this for many years from this very room. You should be looking at effectiveness of wormers at least once a year. Do a fecal egg count reduction test to make sure your egg counts go down at a sufficient level that you would expect if the drug was still working. What we can do more as a research tool is measure when these eggs appear. That could be ascarid eggs or it could be strongyle eggs. After treatment, because moxidectin, for example, was a wonderful drug when it was first developed. It would suppress egg counts for 14, 15, 24 weeks after treatment. Now, commonly, we see eggs coming back after treatment in dung at around 4 to 6 weeks. And in the worst case scenario, and we've had reports recently, and I know from Newmarket in the past, and here, of clinical disease in horses that have been wormed because the wormers aren't working. And that has been a particular issue with some of the farms that we've been working with tapeworm. And here it is. So this is a different sort of parasite. It doesn't have a life cycle that just goes horse, pasture, horse. It goes horse, pasture, intermediate host as a little forage mite, and then the horse has to eat the mite containing the worm. It's a bit like the old lady that swallowed the fly and this, whatever. And then the horse eats the mite with the worm, and it gets infected. And these parasites, they're like, if you would imagine if you took a bit of conchiglie pasta and you flattened it out and stretched it a bit. Hope we're not having pasta for lunch. Stretched it out, it would look like a tapeworm. Although you do get some big longer ones, and we seem to really, you'll see some in the pictures later that are really quite meaty worms from some of the cases that we've been brought to our attention. Foals can be infected by eating the mites a couple of months old, and it really is, it's a bit different from the strongyles. Some farms hardly have this parasite at all, and it probably affects historically horses that have been infected there, or the availability of the mite, intermediate host, the type of soil, and then other farms or yards have a higher prevalence of this parasite. So it does vary, and you won't know which horses are infected because usually horses don't show clinical signs of disease, so testing really helps to identify the prevalence and presence of infection. And sadly now, and this is my bad news, sorry Julian and everyone, I was going to say, well, hopefully I'll have better news than the last time you listened to me last year and many years before. And I used to always talk about drug resistance in roundworms. Sadly, we're now seeing reports of drug resistance in tapeworm, with published reports from Kentucky, from Martin Nielsen's group, 2 last year, and these were mares and foals on a stud farm locally in the United States. And we've now had people reach out to us from the EU about their concerns about praziquantel not working. In the United States case, it was both pyrantel and praziquantel that didn't kill the worms in the infected animals. So there are resistance to both compounds emerging, and as I said at the beginning, we now have documented resistance in all the important parasites of horses that we have to deal with. The bad news, I suppose, from a perspective of the impact of resistance with tapeworm is that there have been many studies published that have shown you only need about 20 worms or more to cause severe damage in the intestine within a horse. And this is a nice study done by Pavoni et al. About 14 years ago, where they took horses from an abattoir and they looked at the level of mucosal damage within the gut wall, and they grouped those horses according to their burden. And even with horses that were grouped in the range of 20 to 100 tapeworms, they could see this extensive ulceration and damage within the intestinal wall. And then what you get with that type of damage and the effects on the enteric nervous system is you can get interruptions in the motility of the intestine. So you have things like colic, where you have intussusception of one bit of the colon, spiralling into the next. And of course, with these great big meaty worms, they like to live at the ileocecocolic junction, which is a very narrow junction within the horse's intestine. I don't know how horses actually evolved, because they've got quite a ridiculous intestinal system, but there they are, they're still here, and they have worms. So, these worms are actually at the ileocecocolic junction, and they can block it, and then you get impaction colic. To be fair of the evolution of the horse, they didn't tend to graze in their own toilet when they were evolving, so they did move away from the worms. So it's really an us issue. The problem's us, it's not them. We have large red worm, Strongylis vulgaris, which was virtually, we hope, eradicated by the advent of the extensive use of broad-spectrum anthelmintics, particularly ivermectin, which killed these migratory stages of the large red worm, which went to the cranial mesenteric artery. And in that place, the worms could cause clots, which would lead to infarctions and lead to a very nasty colic. This was a cause of severe death in horses right up to the development of the modern worming protocols as we knew them. What we don't know is, as we encourage people to reduce the use of wormers in horses, will this parasite re-emerge? And that's something that we need to keep in our mind as a negative sequelae of a reduction in the use of broad-spectrum anthelmintics. So, how worried do we need to be? Camilla sent me that question, and I would say probably we need to be really quite worried, and we really need to act now, is the answer, just because of the sad stories that I've just been telling you. So let's take this and how can we be positive about this? What can we do? What are the solutions that we can use at farm level? Well, we need to understand what worms might be there, how they might be distributed between the animals that are on our paddocks that we're managing. And we need to find out by using tests to work out which worms are there and who's affected by which worms. What we need to do is underpin that by excellent management and to reduce that force of infection that horses, particularly young horses, are exposed to while they graze. We need to be honest and think, well, we've been using these wormers a long time. Let's actually see how effective they are, because actually, if you're given fenbendazole for the control of small strongyles or small redworm, you're probably just as well giving milk. So it'd be good if you insist on using it, test it and see if it works. And you could say the same with Parascaris and ivermectin. If you want to use it, see if it's effective. So what sort of things do we need to understand in a risk-based approach to worm control? And these are conversations that you should have with your prescriber. Anytime you're thinking of a wormer, you should be using a wormer, administering a wormer, you should be having this conversation, especially on a stud farm, with your veterinary surgeon. You need to think about the horses that are there, their age profile, how are they grouped, what are their grazing patterns, and what's been done in terms of other elements of control. Is dung removed? Have they been using ruminants to crossgrade? Have they been using pasture resting? What are all these things that you need to put together to understand what is the risk at that level? And what we're hoping to do at Austin Davis is develop a risk tool that people can just access online for free. So we'll put scores against these. It'll go through beta versions this year, but we'd hope that will help people like yourself. We're not going to make any profit out of it, but just to get an idea of all the different complexity of things that you need to put in to add up to say, well, here we're in high risk or here we're in low risk. In terms of, we've talked about the population, we've talked about management. What about the likelihood of resistance being there? What sort of a worming programme has been applied in the past? What types of wormers have been used? Have you done any efficacy testing? What was the result? Has acceptable efficacy been measured? If not, you should do it. And worst case scenario, is there any level of parasite-associated disease on your farm? And that would be colics, foals not doing it very well, respiratory signs in foals, diarrhea, other intestinal disturbances, and you would then work with your vet that they would assess whether there's another cause of those potential intestinal or other systemic signs, or whether it could be associated with the presence of parasites, and concerningly, drug-resistant parasites. So together you accumulate this knowledge on management practices, you define the level of risk and identify if there's any gaps in those management practices that are applied, and with your vet you address those interventions. You have to take a pragmatic approach because we understand that not everybody can do everything that's perfect on a farm. It might be hilly, it might be too big, there might be other things in the way, but you have to take a pragmatic approach just to reduce that risk. And this would just be the type of scoring system that we would expect people to start to think about, and then you could score the animals, and then we could provide a level of score. And if it was an individual horse on 5 acres and poo was lifted every day and it was 15, it'd be right down there. Your foals on your stud farms and your yearlings, they're going to be somewhere up here, and you can push that back by good pasture management and understanding the parasites are there and treating appropriately. And then we can score them. And then the idea would be to design the interventions around your scores, identify your gaps, and then you would do your next assessment with your vet. So, well, we've done those interventions. Let's use diagnostic tests to see if there's an improvement. Have your egg counts gone down? Have your saliva scores gone down? Are the animals clinically better? What other measures can we do? So it becomes, it's not just a one-off thing. It's an ongoing piece of work, depending on your risk score, that you would look at every 3, 6, or 12 months. With whoever's providing your advice on parasite control. The principles behind reducing anthelmintic use, again, I can't say enough about good pasture hygiene, ideally dung removal, and Paul's going to come back to that in the next session. I'll talk a little bit about the research behind that now. And lowering, these are actually larvae in a raindrop on a paddock. Can you imagine a horse? That's just one blade and the number of worms that are on that blade. If you can lift dung more regularly, you stop the eggs developing to hatch and release the larvae, which would then go onto the blade of grass to be consumed by the horse. If you drive down that infection level, what you'll do if you test the horses, you'll have less animals needing treatment and therefore reduce your selection pressure for drug resistance. So rather than saying target those individual worms in the horse with drugs and hope you eradicate them, you have to start here. You have to think about dung removal. You have to think about removing those stages on pasture. You have to think about stocking density, reducing the infection load. And you have to think about what tests can we use to identify which horses are more susceptible to higher burdens and which ones we need to target with dewormers. There are some stages of worms and particular groups of animals that we can't actually use the test for that purpose, and then that's when you consider a strategic treatment, for example, a larvicidal dose of anthelmintic against small red worm in young at-risk horses, ideally with a product that works. So pasture management is very straightforward from a kind of conceptual sense, probably a pain in the you-know-what from a practical sense. But I'm so glad to see when I speak to people that run stud farms around here, so many have taken on this as part of their general management. When you remove the dung, please place it well away from any horses that graze, and also well away from water courses. An eminent vet who's actually here today did tell me that they'd seen a case of larval cyathostomonosis in a horse next to a dung pile because the owner thought they were doing the right thing, and here all the worms were coming out. I might show you data later where actually, take worm again, the people say, oh, we do dung removal, it's great. And then we was like, but why are the horses positive all the time? They say, oh yeah, we just put it up in that top field and that's where they graze in the winter. So you've got to get that dung away. And don't put it in your water because the stuff that wormers that we give horses and other things in dung can be quite ecotoxic. Low stocking density is ideal. Rest pastures ideally for 12 months because the worms, particularly, not so much ascarid eggs and mites, but the strongyl worms, they will die out from one season by the middle of the next season because they run out of energy, they can't feed. So it's quite good to rest at least for the 6 months and consider grazing with ruminants, ideally between groups and ideally in that 6 months when you're resting the pasture from horses. Obviously speak to your vet because you have to consider the risk of liver fluke if you're doing any grazing at all with ruminants. So dung removal, does it work? This is a lovely study which was carried out here in Newmarket in the 80s by a very nice man called Rupert Herd. And he was, you can see, he actually had, he just would think out the box and he thought, right, okay, what we'll do is we'll take plots with different horses in Newmarket on different paddocks, and what we'll do is we'll remove dung from one set of paddocks, and then we'll treat yearlings and not remove dung, we'll treat geldings and not remove dung, and we'll treat, well, in these cases he used oxybendazole, and then we'll use this new wonder drug, ivermectin, and we'll not remove dung. And the only take-home message here is you can see where they didn't even worm, and where the ponies had a high fecal egg count, you didn't see this peak in larvae. This is the number of larvae on the pastures and paddocks that they measured. They didn't actually see the peak. And if you've got yearlings and young horses particular consuming this level, it's 10,000 L3 per kilogram. That's a lot of worms when you think how much herbage a horse eats per day. These are going to put these horses at risk of larval cyathostomonosis. So dung removal works. We followed this up by a study at the donkey sanctuary where we did twice weekly dung removal in paddocks with donkeys, either compared to no dung removal. And this is egg counts. This is downstream egg counts, even in the space of a season, removed by automated means and removed by manual means. And what we found was you had this, even on fecal egg counts, you had this impact on fecal egg counts by removing dung twice a week. We also looked in the leisure sector where we were looking at yards in a bigger study, and we were doing some questionnaire analysis where we said, do you do dung removal? And then they said yes or no, so we categorised these yards into dung removal yards and non-dung removal. Then we treated the horses with moxidectin, or Quest, and then we followed them every 2 weeks after treatment to see how the egg counts were. So the take-homes were horses that were grazing paddocks where no dung removed started off with higher egg counts, and the egg counts came back quicker. It's a very simple, basic study, but it just shows you the impact, even on these normal, regular yards, of removing dung. This was back to a study that was funded by the Levy Board over 10 years ago, where we worked particularly with stud farmers around this part of England, but in other parts of the UK, and we questionnared them. We did look at prevalence of parasites and we did efficacy studies, and this is the questionnaire results. And even within this relatively small cohort of around 70 stud farms, we found that the risk factors and the odds ratio that impacted Parascaris shedding, so I put this on because it's important for you, anyone that's raising foals, is you could see the things that are affecting a reduction in Parascaris egg counts and foals is resting paddocks and removing faeces from pasture. So we were getting significant values even in this very small cohort. So we must use tests then to provide the data, to provide information on which horses to treat and which horses might be at risk of disease. And that is where I'm going to stop.
Thank you so much, Jacqui. Have we got any? We are going to have a discussion before lunch. So has anyone got any quick burning questions? Otherwise, you can save it till later. Oh, quick questions. Ooh.
Thank you very much for your brilliant lecture. I would like to ask you, when you would measure a reduction test in 2 weeks' time, when you will get worried, like would the number would be 50% less is okay, or would you expect a little bit more?
Okay, so there's a pragmatic approach to take to fecal egg count reduction, and then the World Association for the Advancement of Veterinary Parasitology produces this very complex framework. But what we would say is, and I'll come back to this in the next talk, is actually, so you would look at the efficacy that would be expected. So for the macrocyclic lactones, ivermectin and moxidectin, you would expect over 99%. So if you had a mean reduction in egg count below 95%, you would be concerned about a reduced efficacy. Now, we have loads of egg count data from some of the stud farms around here. It's really important to look at the data. So if there's one horse, for example, it's a real outlier and it brings it below 95%, then you need to either repeat the test or consider it as a suspect, or look at other cohorts within that particular stud. So ideally, you'd be looking for all horses to have a mean reduction of below 95%. For Parentel and fenbendazole, they have a labelled efficacy that's a bit lower than the macrocyclic lactones, so that would be 90%. So you would be looking for a mean reduction in efficacy of less than 90% at 2 weeks post-treatment. The work that's done from sheep shows you that by the time you measure that level of reduction or reduced reduction in efficacy, there's a lot of resistant alleles within the population, so it's quite late. If you're getting a 50% reduction, then you would say that product is really not working. And I mean, oftentimes when we use fenbendazole for the strong giles, I didn't show this data today, but we stopped giving the foals fenbendazole or the young horses in our stud study because the egg counts were actually going up. In some cases, they were just not going down at all. But so 95 for MLs and 90% for BZs and Parentel, but looking at the distribution of the data as well.
Can I just carry on? In case you will then detect that your product is not working, then what is your next choice?
Well, it depends on the parasite. So obviously you would look at the other products that are available, and then you would come back and look at it. The thing is, if it's about 80% and it's 80% for them all, you don't have any other choice. So you have to try and, first of all, go, right, what we have to do is reduce the force of infection. Here we have to reduce the risk so that when we go in and we test the horses, we're using less product. So you would have to take that approach. You know, I've had conversations with vets in practice where they say, well, nothing's working. And with one of the data sets that we put up there. And at that stage, you have to then either, particularly with ascarids and with tapeworm, you have to think about taking them off that pasture permanently and finding them somewhere else to do, and then using the drugs. I've never seen a situation yet where there's a 0% efficacy, and that's why now is the time to act, to actually hope that we don't get there, and if there are no new products that are developed. And that's why I wanted to really highlight the tapeworm issue as well, because we need to stop using praziquantel and Parentel 2X all the time, just as we'll give them an annual or a biannual treatment for tapeworm, because I think there's been a bit of a lag there, but we're seeing resistance, so we have time to act now. With ascarids, we have time to act, hopefully with the non-MLs, and look at efficacy. And with the strong giles, we still have some efficacy retained to ML, so we've got time to act now. So we just actually reduce the use of these drugs to prolong their effectiveness where they're working.
Thank you.
Hiya, two quick management questions. Your opinion on harrowing and also grays and sheep alongside horses.
Cool. So harrowing, I think, is a bad idea. So in the UK, it's fine if you were in India and you're in some sort of climate where we're really dry, because the idea of harrowing was used to spread the parasites out, and they would desiccate. They're quite, the L3, even the eggs L1, L2 and L3 of strong giles are quite susceptible to the effects of desiccation. As you can see, particularly from the data that Joe put up with the rainfall level, we don't have that opportunity in the United Kingdom, and it's unpredictable. So all you're really doing is spreading those worms about the paddock. So for worm control, I would recommend harrowing. You take the poo away and you compost it properly. Now, there's a whole discussion to be had about the impact of taking poo away, and I don't have a solution for that yet. I suppose you can make sure your poo is worm-free and, you can do it. But anyway, that's a whole other discussion. The other question was...
Grazing sheep alongside
So you could graze them
horses.
alongside. If you have everything is a step towards the dilutionary effect of the worms. So if it suits you better to graze alongside, that's fine. The only thing I would say is if it's a high risk factor that's very pasture that's very contaminated from the year before, you're not using that environmental effect to reduce that infection load. So what you're doing, you've got two options. You can either rest and then rest for a long time and make the pasture safer for strong giles. Or you can rest and put sheep in to manage the pasture, but also to eat up the worms that are there. Or you can keep the horses and the sheep there. So it can be done. It's a better thing than not doing anything at all, but it's probably not as good as doing the intermittent effect.
Thank you.
And I've got data on that somewhere, but maybe that's for tonight. Rossdale's.
Thank
Too
you.
many talks today.
I think Charlie had a question, another one over there.
Thank you. Does overworming in young stock affect the development of immunity, and is that correlated with higher worm burdens in adult horses?
Interesting question. So I think with Parascaris, there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that, although someone did contact me recently and said, oh, I had Parascaris, my adult horse, that got picked up, but that horse did have an immune problem, so that could have been part of that thing, so it made it more susceptible. So I think with Parascaris, because we were always taught it's an age immunity, I don't really know what that means, it's probably just in a better adaptive response. The overworming of horses for strong giles is a very interesting concept to see if actually this reduction in exposure to the worms in early life is actually making them more susceptible later on. And we don't know. No one's actually ever looked at that and done a large enough controlled study to look at it. And the problem with that is what we seem to know from experimental studies that if you infect horses, they are very, very variable response to the level of parasite burden that they have. It's a massive response. So Sandy Love in the 90s did some experimental studies in ponies, and he did these trickle infections to try and mimic those larvae coming from pasture, and he gave them millions of worms. And what he found was that in this study, one of the studies that he did, 2 horses developed larval cyatostominosis, they got ill, and when the horses came to be necropsied, what they found in one horse that was ill, it had over 1.5 million worms, and the other horse that developed disease by the stage, which was about 8 weeks after it started clinical signs, it only had 10,500 worms. This is a huge discrepancy in burden, which I'll come back to when I talk about our test later on, that seem to cause clinical signs. So with the disease concept, you have this, it's multifactorial, so it's age, exposure for the horse, its burden, but also its own response. I think it's a really good question, because if we could look back, and maybe there's people in the audience who can say this, did we see larval cyatostominosis in the 50s and 60s? Did we recognise it? Did we not call it that disease then because we didn't recognise it? Or did we not see it because it wasn't there, because we had animals that developed a slower immunity and trickled over time?
Is this a global issue? Are Australia and the US suffering the same situation?
Absolutely. So, because I'd only had half an hour, I usually have a big slide of the global gloomy status of anthelmintic resistance in horseworms in the world. There's people in the audience that have seen that big global table, and I've written reviews and things on it. It's even worse in America because they came up with this great idea to give Pyrentel every day to stop strong gile infection. So they have really bad Pyrentel resistance in small red worm. We're kind of on the cusp, so that's why we should preserve, test and treat as appropriate. So it's probably worse in the States. Who knows, in South America it's probably really bad. They use a lot of generic products which maybe they're not optimized in terms of the amount of active ingredient in them. So the first reports of ivermectin and moxidectin resistance have come out of Brazil, and I think the state of resistance there is really bad. Australia is probably about the same as us.
Thank you. I think in the interest of... you're allowed one.
One quick one, sorry.
Sorry, Paul.
I've got to ask a really dopey question that's going to be a short answer. Haven't we got anything that will manage the paddock rather than treating the horse?
Well, apart from our own physical
But nothing we can
hard work,
spray on?
anything that we spray on, I think, would be an environmental no-no.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Positive. That was a good seg into yours.
Yeah, perfect.
That was a big question.